I'm joined by Emma Boardwell, and we unpack her methodology around trust, connection and collaboration, which helps to develop emotional intelligence in a structured way. If you're an advisor and want to build strong emotional relationships, then you won't want to miss out on this episode. Hi Emma, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for inviting me.
No, hopefully it'll be an absolute pleasure. So Emma, tell me about your background and we can work into why we're having this conversation, because it's very different from the usual.
Sure. So my background is as a psychotherapist.
Okay.
I worked as a psychotherapist for many years and trained other psychotherapists. And then during the pandemic, I worked a lot with groups. And during the pandemic, we hadn't quite worked out how to deal with groups on Zoom yet. And so I began thinking about, it felt like a good time to be thinking more broadly. And I actually trained to be a financial advisor, thinking that actually, so people said to me, that's a really big shift. And I would say
That's exactly what my mind was just thinking. I'm thinking, sorry, I thought, I'm a psychotherapist. Oh, do you know what I'll do? I'll go into financial advice.
But actually, the way I saw it is it wasn't that different, because really what I imagined I'd be doing was helping people with the landscape of their lives, but just through the lens of their finances, that I would be helping people. Psychotherapy is a helping profession, and I saw financial advice as a helping profession. And then when I took my first role, I realised why people had asked me, because I realised that they were incredibly different, because what I saw was missing from financial advice was leading with benevolence and caring. And I saw how much the technical work took priority above the relational work. And that's at the point at which I thought, okay, well, I'm actually really well placed to fill this gap. And I founded my business, Emotional Finance.
Okay. And you sort of said that lots of things were missing. How did you see what you're doing then and it evolving?
Well, I guess it evolved sort of slowly. It dawned on me, because when I finished, I actually trained not thinking I was going to be a financial advisor. And the more I did the exams, the more I thought, oh, well, actually, this is really interesting and it's something I want to do. So I sort of inched towards it rather than it being a decision that I declaratively made. And as I inched forward, I was thinking, well, where's this next piece? When are we going to get taught about how to build relationships, how to listen, how to chew over dilemmas or things that clients were stuck on? And I sat waiting and waiting until I realised, oh, that actually doesn't seem to ever happen. And I realised how dominant all the training was in terms of the technical work. So it was a slow realisation, really. And then when I realised that that part was missing, I decided to top up my own training, and I went and did a qualification in financial coaching.
Okay.
Which, of course, went some way towards meeting that gap. But I still saw that there was something to fill.
Okay. So how did you move forward from that? So you said you've not advised, so you've moved more into this coaching, mentoring piece. So what does that look like?
No, I didn't advise. I decided at that point that this was an opportunity. I'd never done anything entrepreneurial before, so it was quite a big decision, but I decided to give it a go. And really, it's kind of evolved. It started off with me mentoring and coaching individual advisors. And from that, I built a training program, and I've been doing consultancy with larger firms, and I speak at various events, kind of evangelizing and spreading the word, I guess.
Okay, and you've now sort of built a whole framework, haven't you, that you
That's right.
sort of teach people. So tell me about that framework. What does it look like?
Well, it's a model.
Okay.
It's a framework, it's a model. You can find it on my website, because it's quite useful to sometimes see it visually. And I'm not going to do a great job of explaining it visually as we sit here. But really, it's a framework or a model, a methodology, I guess, that's based on my 12 years of training as a psychotherapist, working as a psychotherapist and training other psychotherapists. So what I've done, I guess, is I've taken a training to be a therapist and I've filtered it through the lens of which of these skills is important for giving attuned, relationally aware financial advice. So there's 3 principles. The first is trust.
Right.
And here I'm coming from a perspective of, I think sometimes in financial services, trust is assumed. It's kind of, there's a quote by Stephen Covey. He says, now let me see if I'm going to get it right. Trust is the hidden ingredient that affects everything. And I think what he's talking about there is that it's like a kind of hidden operating system.
Yeah.
But it obviously is in everything, in all our interactions, in all our conversations. So in my model, I try to make it visible and explicit, and I talk about 4 specific behaviours to build the conditions of trust, and that's benevolence, caring, integrity, transparency, and I'm talking about a more radical transparency than just being transparent about fees, and obviously competence. And the second ring is around connection. So it's about ensuring that clients feel known and understood, rather than what I think often happens in financial advice is we kind of dig and feel like we need to know everything about the client. And actually, I change that perspective into the client feeling known.
So sort of nearly flipping it. So as you say, the advisor goes in, they do their first meeting and they think, right, I need to get all of the information I can. You know, we call it a fact find meeting, don't we? So that even sounds sort of not exactly the most caring thing. So we're basically switching that around. Actually, you need to be giving the client everything about you for them to understand. Is that right?
It's not necessarily about giving the client everything about you, but it's much more about making sure that the client feels known. So allowing them to lead what they want you to know about them. What's important for me to know about you to be, you know, your ideal financial planner. So what is it that you need me to know? Because sometimes I find there's a trend or a tendency in financial planning to feel like in order to know the client, we need to ask these deeply insightful or powerful questions. And sometimes that doesn't get quite aligned to what the client wants. And so I listen to client meetings and I can hear the client kind of feeling backed into a corner or a bit interrogated.
Right.
So it's much less about digging and extracting information and much more about finding a stance that invites information so that the client's able to be the conductor. That's a terrible word, the conductor, but in charge, to have the autonomy.
Okay. And what's the third?
And the third ring is collaboration, which is very much about sharing the expertise in the room. Because of course, advisors and planners are experts in their field. That expertise is hard won. We've talked about the technical route to training, but actually the client is the expert on themselves. So it's much more about co-creating solutions and building the relationship and making that relationship tangible and visible, and I guess sharing the power and control that's inherent in that relationship.
So you sort of, the first thing you talk about is trust, and we've spoken before, and you said you sort of have to build it by design as opposed to by accident, which I find is a fascinating statement. So what do you mean by that?
I think that trust is treated in a kind of quite passive way in the profession. It's implicit. I said about Stephen Covey that it's hidden, it's implicit. And we're kind of hoping that by being warm and competent and good at our jobs, that somehow trust will kind of make its way via osmosis, or that it will be contagious. I'm working quite a lot at the moment with advisors thinking about how to bridge the gap to the generational wealth transfer. And there's a kind of passivity about thinking, well, if I have a good relationship with somebody's parents, then that goodwill and that trust will automatically follow. And I think that that's a dangerous assumption to make. So I think that trust needs to be, as I've said, explicit, tangible. Advisors need to talk about it, to say to new clients when they can see a bit of hesitation or wariness or skepticism, you know, I'm not assuming that you trust me. This is something we might need to build together. What do you need from me?
And do you think, I'm thinking about some of the advisors in my firm, that would make advisors uncomfortable? Because I do think that they 100% think they walk in, and of course they need to build rapport and they build trust, and that's why we do, one-to-one and face-to-face meetings, so you can get that with body language and everything else. But if you sort of said to an advisor, right, you need to talk about trust, like actively talk about it to people, I think they might be slightly terrified.
I haven't got a good answer for that, because I think it's true.
Yeah.
This is a new skill. And it's all very well to say that, but at first it might feel awkward and uncomfortable, and you might be a bit clumsy, which is why it's so important to try these conversations out and get better at them and practice them before the stakes are high and you're actually in with your client. But I think it's a clumsiness and an awkwardness that's worth embracing, because I think the alternative means that we carry on as we've been before. And in the climate that we're in, where, AI is doing much of the technical work, where we do have this wealth transfer looming, and where there's issues with succession, I personally feel like we need to define the skills that are essential to have an ideal client relationship, and what's expected of us as advisors, or you as advisors, to do that. And then be brave and courageous and show those skills, because it's that will be the differentiator. It's that will ensure that you have value beyond your technical expertise.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point, because the AI sort of piece is everywhere, and we're talking about it and all that sort of stuff. And it is getting much more advanced on the technical aspect. So, people would say, I'm a pension specialist, or I'm this or that or the other. And actually, you can get AI to do that for you. So it becomes, well, what's your value then as an advisor? Where do you bring the value? And it has to be on that relational side. It has to be on that. But it's, how do they build that? And how do they build that properly? Because I talk to my advisors, and lots of them will say, well, I'm a therapist, or I'm a confidant, I'm this, I'm that, I'm the other. And I'm like, well, you were an advisor as well. What do you think about that then? Those different sort of blurred lines that we can get?
I think you're underlining the importance of why we need to define what a good professional advisor-client relationship looks like. Because what I notice in the work that I do almost daily is that without a blueprint, without a definition of what we're aiming for, advisors try to find a solution by doing one of two things. And I'm going to be quite extreme. Of course, there's places in the middle. But if I take the two extremes, one is that advisors don't want to feel awkward. They don't quite know how to deal with it when a couple are warring in front of them, or a client's upset because they're grieving their mum and they feel anxious about, or not anxious, maybe guilty about spending the money. So when emotions surface, they kind of contort around the feelings or avoid them, and they go into kind of technical tunnel vision to try to cope, because they're not quite sure what else they should be doing. Or what I find is that advisors at the extreme do the opposite, and they become a quasi-therapist. They think that their value is in hearing and supporting and unearthing these emotions and being somebody's support mechanism. And neither of those are particularly helpful, I don't think. And the way I think out of those two traps is to have a defined way of, okay, so how do I deal with this in a way that's professional and allows me to be the best financial advisor or planner that I can be?
Sorry to interrupt the episode, but this one's for the financial advisors that are listening. If you're thinking about the next stage in your career, ask yourself this: is your firm built for what's coming next? At Foster Denovo, we believe that the future advice is human first. Emotional intelligence built around real relationships. Alongside that, we invest in leading technology and AI that improves how you work. Less friction, more time with clients. If you're ready to grow your career in a firm that takes both people and progress seriously, you'll find the details in the show notes. Now back to the episode. And so how would an advisor approach that then, and like through using your framework and the way that you describe things? So if they're told something that is quite an intimate detail, or, you know, people do get divorced and people are going through lots of different things, and very often advisors have the parents, don't they, or they have a couple, so they will hear sort of both sides of it. How do they deal with that information without crossing a line? Because you sort of automatically want to help, don't you? You want to sort of, you know, you just do, and you side and you have bias and all of that. So how is the way to approach that then, would you say?
Sure. Well, I guess the disclaimer I want to make first is that there is not one way to do that, because we're all different. We all have our own ways of dealing with things. And if I asked someone to have a particular conversation in a particular way, I'd be asking them to be inauthentic. But if we take a step back from that, and the advisor understands what is empathy, what are we looking for when we're offering an empathic response? How do I feel about empathy? What's my best way of showing empathy? So in the ring that I talked about, the connection ring, that's where those skills live. So we talk there about dialogue, which is the skills of listening and asking curious rather than interrogatory questions, where we talk about being present. So that's the kind of emotional literacy, which is being able to notice and respond to emotions. And also the relational intelligence part of that, which is about noticing what's happening in a dynamic, either between you and I, advisor and client, or between a client couple or a client family. And knowing and having, and importantly, having practiced how to support clients in those sorts of conversations. So it's about a skill set that you can observe and see. So I can listen to a client conversation and I can say, okay, so here you were showing empathy. There you were showing presence. You know, here maybe there was an opportunity to do blah, blah, blah.
Okay. So you're analysing the conversation that they're having and looking at ways that you can better frame it, etc., and make sure that it lies on the more professional side of things. Because I think by nature we all want to sort of get in there and help, don't we? And it's quite a hard skill to learn not to.
Yeah.
It's interesting because when we were talking about this before, I think we've sort of, and I think a lot of advice firms have this, right? We've sort of got two camps now. So we've got a little bit the old guard and the new guard. And we've got, and it's rife in wealth management firms, isn't it? You have the retiring partners, you know, that have been directors, they've been doing it for 30 odd years, they've got their client bank, they've known them for eons. And then you've got the young guys that are coming up, and girls coming up and starting to learn and all that sort of stuff. And when we talked about the trusted advisor thing, we had this conversation and I sort of went out, I'm not sure if I agree with Emma. I think it's good that they are, you know, a confidant and all this sort of stuff. And I went out and I spoke to two of my advisors, and one chap's 74. And I said to him, oh, how do you feel about this statement? And he said, well, yes, I'm friends with lots of my clients. I've known them for so many years, and et cetera, et cetera. And then I spoke to a chap next to him who's 34. And he went, no, I completely agree. He said, I don't want to be friends with my clients. He said, I want to know them, but I want to know them enough that I can help them in this way, but I want to keep a distance. And I thought, well, that's very interesting, because I assumed that everyone sort of just wanted to be mates with their clients as well. And if they weren't, did they know them well enough?
I think you're picking up on two related things, but they're slightly different. So the first is about doing the quasi-therapy thing. And there's problems inherent with that. But for now, I want to just kind of pull out the main problem for the advisors, which is that's a lot of emotional weight to carry. If you're the emotional crutch for a client inappropriately, so of course you want to offer empathy in this boundary professional way. But if a client is calling you for emotional support and you haven't been trained to hold that, that's quite a heavy thing.
Yeah.
So there's that. But then you also talked about friendship. And I think that's a really important and very understandable kind of trend, especially with, as you said, I think you used the word old guard, because they've often been working with their clients for many, many years. But I think the particular landscape we're in right now is really important, because friendships by nature are in some ways symmetrical. They're give and take.
Yeah.
Both are invested in a particular way. But a professional relationship is, intentionally asymmetrical. The fees only go one way.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if then the technical expertise is removed and the relationship moves center stage, and the relationship is one of give and take, then it's much harder to articulate and to justify your fee.
God, I need to think about that. You're completely right. Like that makes perfect sense. It absolutely does. Because as you said, it's not symmetrical in any way, shape or form. You're not phoning your clients for advice. So no, I think that's really, really interesting. And I think we have missed that. And I think we have blurred lines. And of course, as you said, like it is nuanced. Of course it is.
Of course it is. Yeah.
And you are always going to be closer to some and not to others. But I think that's quite an important takeaway from this. And actually, I found it interesting that my sort of 34-year-old advisor felt like that.
Yeah.
And they are taking more of a stance. I wonder in that, thinking about in those terms, if you've got somebody that came to you and they've been an advisor for 30, 40 years and they've been running their firm, etc. And they said, right, Emma, I think, how can you help me? How can your framework help me? I've been doing this for 30 years. I know it all. We've all met them. I know it all. I know what I'm doing. What you're talking about trust. Trust is instinctive to me. How would you shape around working with them and your framework?
It's a great question because I'm kind of not here to convince them to be different.
Okay.
So if they come to me and they're genuinely curious, I guess what I would be checking is, okay, and what's your motivation for doing this? And if they genuinely do want to learn something, then I guess the first step is to ask them if they're willing to unlearn some of their habits. And if they are, then I would probably proceed as I would with absolutely everybody else. And then you might need to kind of invite them to be a bit more reflective about what this means, because, you know, unlearning is hard. So I would probably need to, you know, I'd be thinking about I'd be practicing what I preach, and I'd be working really hard to make sure that I was offering them support and challenge in a way that felt like relationally they knew they could rely on me.
Okay. And I think the reflective piece is interesting because I don't think we do that very much at all. I don't think my advisors sit there and reflect on scenarios that they've been in or how they've dealt with them or how could I have done this better. How would you get people to do that more? How can we encourage that?
Yeah.
Because I think that's really valuable.
I think that's a huge cultural question. And, you know, not all, I don't want to be that as blanket as that, but in most professions where the relationship forms so much part of what you're offering, reflective practice is something that's standard. So I guess at an individual level, I would be encouraging advisors to be intentional about thinking about their relationship skills and the relationships with their clients. So as when they take their notes after a meeting, I would encourage them to just spend 5 minutes thinking about that meeting. At what points do you feel like you were building trust? You know, just sort of put the spotlight of attention onto their relationship. So on an individual level, that's not a difficult thing to do. And then I suppose at a wider level, you know, if I had my magic wand and I could go in, I would be creating reflective practice groups where advisors could say, oh, I had a conversation with this client today and this happened and it didn't feel great and I wonder what I could have done differently. And have you had a client that's behaved like that and what did you do? And where these sorts of conversations and this openness and willingness to be clumsy and talk about it and learn from each other is built into the structure and the DNA of a firm, because that's that reflective practice is how you keep learning and keep growing. And I believe that we need to be intentional about that.
No, I think so, and I know, I can guarantee, we're not doing a lot of that in my firm, and I don't think there is a lot of other firms where they are doing that. I mean, we have mentoring groups, etc., which I actually think is a really great thing, and I've got it with sort of advisors that have been with us for say 10 years that are mentoring the more junior ones, so so they can feel the relationship and they can feel how close they are to getting to that next step. We talk about sort of advisors and them being sort of outgoing and, loud and all this sort of stuff generally, and not introverted. And a lot of people would say, well, that's nature versus nurture. What would you... Oh, you've ummed me there, Emma. Okay. You've ummed me in a way that you don't believe what I'm saying, which I've enjoyed. But what do you think?
I think my bit was about... I don't necessarily... subscribe to the idea that most advisors and the successful advisors are extrovert.
Okay.
I think that has probably been the case in years gone by because of the mentoring, in a way, means that the qualities of more senior advisors are seen to be what you need to emulate.
Yeah.
And in many ways, I think that is been a huge problem in the industry, because I think that that's responsible in part for the lack of diversity. Because unless you can see yourself reflected in a profession or an industry, you're not necessarily going to feel very welcomed. So that was you're very astute at picking up my there, because I feel a bit skeptical about that, and it raises some concerns for me. But what was the second part of your question? Because now I've forgotten.
No. I just wondered whether you sort of subscribe to the sort of nature nurture thing.
Oh, that's it. Yeah. I think you're absolutely right that there are some people who are much more natural at building relationships, at building empathy, at offering empathy. And often that can get stereotyped into gender roles as well, that women are better at empathy. And my own take on that is that that's very much a conditioning. So, and I think that most people would see that. I think there's an older generation. If we think about the average old guard advisor, let's think about the environment that their career developed in. Very much a kind of boy, I'm gonna stereotype now, but a boys don't cry kind of culture, where certainty and expertise and numbers and technicalities were, what we aspired to. And so in many ways, that more relational empathy, the warmth, wasn't acceptable and was probably left by the wayside. Whereas I think the younger advisors coming through have a different response to that and a different attitude, and they value it more.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think, you mentioned people emulating someone else's style, and it just comes across as inauthentic. And what we're hoping is that people pick up on the technical side, but also how to have a difficult client conversation, all those sorts of things, but doing it in their own way, as opposed to copying someone that's done it that way. It's interesting because you talked about it earlier, succession planning.
Yeah.
And that leads into that, because we do succession planning all the time with our retiring advisors and with acquisitions. And it's so fundamental that you get the pairing right, because you've generally got somebody that's leaving that has managed their book of business for 30 years, are incredibly precious over it. Of course they are. It's what they've done. It's their business. And then you have to bring somebody in to manage that. So cultural fit is really, really key. And it's cultural fit for the advisor, but also for the client bank. But some might say, in what we've been talking about, that that's trying to emulate a personality. So where's the danger in that then?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if this answers your question directly, but the kind of thought that's the loudest in my head as I hear you talk about that is how important it is in succession planning to think about the client. And I know that probably what I'm advocating for is a logistical nightmare, but I would be tempted that instead of taking the responsibility myself to find cultural fit, I would be putting that question back to the client and giving them some autonomy and choice over who their advisor would be, and be involved in that process in a really transparent, curious way. So in many ways, what I'd be looking to do is to filter that whole succession planning through the framework of my model, and thinking about how in the process of planning for succession can we make sure that those relational skills are attended to in a kind of parallel process.
That would be a nightmare. I don't want to dress that up for you. That would be an absolute nightmare.
Yeah.
But I understand why you say it, and it should be on the client. I mean, to be fair, I've done a lot of succession planning in our business, and we take over books of business and clients. And very often the advisors will change the way that things are done, because, somebody used to have a 4-hour meeting for an annual review, and that's sort of not really feasible anymore. That's not how we do. So I think you can shape it while still giving them that advice, etc. But yeah, I cannot go client by client. That is too much for me. It's an absolute nightmare.
But what I hear you say, and I agree, I think that's great, is that what I hear you say is that in the process, okay, so maybe my magic wand scenario is not doable, but what is doable is to have those conversations explicitly with clients. So this is what you're used to. This is how I do it, usually. How can we find a way that meets both our needs and that you don't feel... I had another thought just pop into my head, because what happens often... Because when I do research with clients about what they're looking for with their advisors on behalf of the advice firms that I consult with, clients talk quite openly about feeling fobbed off or handed down during that process. And so whilst, what I'm saying might be a step too far for a large firm like yours, it's about attending to that process in ways that you can, so that they feel that they've had some degree of choice or autonomy, that this isn't being done to them.
No, I absolutely agree. And I think, and we aim to do that properly. There are firms where there is no discussion around it or anything. We will do a year-long succession plan where you go and meet with the partners, and the clients, hopefully, if we've built that benevolence and trust that you talk about, will feel comfortable to say, actually, I don't want this advisor. I'd like somebody else.
Yes.
So that's sort of hopefully the nirvana that we can get to on the succession planning. Just thinking about this. So if you were talking to a new firm and they were thinking, "Oh, this sounds good. I like the sound of this stuff that Emma's talking about. It sounds great. Where do I start? What's is there a baby step? Is there something if they can't engage? What?"
Well, I think the baby step goes back to what I spoke about a little while ago, which is to be intentional. And so to begin to put your spotlight of attention onto this. You might, you could go online and you could take my emotional finance model, and actually advisors that I work with that have been through the training program put that model next to their desk so that they can remind themselves of the skills that they should be demonstrating. So you might take empathy, for example, for the month of March or just for the week, and you might take some notes at the end of your client meetings, looking intentionally for where you demonstrated empathy or moments that you missed. So it doesn't need to be a huge thing, and it doesn't need to be a huge investment. There are things that advisors listening to this podcast could do at the end of today.
Okay, great. And we are in a world of AI, and we're in a world where, the technical side is being taken over, or can be, possibly, not yet. We always still need humans as well. But with that increasing, what do you think makes an advisor truly valuable then?
Well, I mean, there seems to be consensus, doesn't there, that it is the relationship that makes the differentiator. And I think that we've talked about the skills that are involved. And then what I often say is we need to bed those skills in. We need to make sure that we can offer those sorts of relationships. And then we need to give those relationships main character energy. We need to make sure that clients can see those skills, that they're tangible, that they're visible, that relationship is center stage. You can see it from wherever you're sitting in the audience, because then they can articulate and they can know what they're paying for, and they can be delighted that they're paying for it because they can see the benefit.
Okay, yeah. And I'm just really interested in this, and you might not know, but if you're sort of going through your framework or talking to people about these different steps, etc., do you see a different reaction from a younger advisor to an older advisor, or not at all?
I mean, the thing is that I'm probably going to give you a bit of a biased response because I'm only working with advisors who are curious and interested and willing to be reflective.
Sure. Okay.
So I don't, of course, I see nuanced differences, and I see differences in how they respond to the work. Like, often the early career advisors, what's so interesting is the confidence that they gain. So you can just see them kind of expand and their spines grow taller, and you can see that they're just sort of where they'd come, often worrying about not knowing enough, like often quite terrified even of a client asking them a question and then them not knowing the answer. You can see how that doesn't become a preoccupation anymore, how they feel just so much more confident and lighter and more engaged in the whole process because they're not worrying about that anymore. Whereas what I find interesting about working with business owners and more experienced advisors is a kind of introspection that happens that means that they have quite a number of kind of aha moments.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of slower percolating in kind of a vibe with the older experienced advisors. And I think that actually they often feel refreshed from that experience because sometimes they come a bit jaded.
Yes.
Yes, that can. And a bit sort of frustrated. Often more experienced advisors come with a kind of, there's a common frustration with, well, I know what I'm doing. I've told my clients what to do and they're not doing it.
Yeah.
And when they have a new perspective on that, which is, okay, what might be happening for that client? What might you be missing? Where are your blind spots? It makes the whole process more interesting again. So I see them kind of refreshed.
I can absolutely see that happening because you just get stuck in the way that you do things, and this is how we've done it, and this is how I've done it for so many years, that sometimes you need to take your step back, don't you, and have a really sort of good hard look at what you're doing. And somebody like you coming in can sort of shine a bit of a light and say, let's have a look at this. I suppose to go full circle to back to the beginning, what do you think we're missing then from a training perspective for financial advisors? Because we do the technical, we do that till the cows come home, don't we?
We do.
And, you know, way back when, everyone used to go and do sales training, and they used to do, you know, the banks were very keen on doing it, you know, pre-RDR and all of that sort of stuff. So what do you think nowadays we're missing, and how can we make that better?
Well, I think, you know, it's probably an incredibly obvious answer, but I think that we need training in how to build relationships and what good relationships look like. Simply that.
You have it there. Thank you very much, Emma. That's been brilliant.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that. Thank you.